Hilda Raz, and I was for many decades the editor-in-chief of the literary journal, the international literary journal called Prairie Schooner. And I was also the Glenna Lushai professor and editor of Prairie Schooner and a professor in the English department in creative writing, which was part of the PhD in English for writers and remains a major degree. We had brilliant students who have gone on to become themselves full professors and publish their work. It's been a great joy for me. And I worked closely with Grace Bauer, with whom I will be reading this afternoon. Grace and I were poets in the department, and she has recently retired, and I retired in 2010, and with my husband, Dale Nordyke, whom you may know as one of the founders of The Mill, the coffee place, which has been a great pleasure for all of us. We moved to Placitas, New Mexico, where I am now the editor and director of the Mary Burritt Christensen Poetry Series.
Hi, my name is Grace Bauer. I'm originally from Pennsylvania and have lived in various places across the country, Ohio, Virginia, New Orleans, Montana. So lots of places, but I've been in Lincoln for 25 years. I came here for a job at the University of Nebraska, where I taught for 25 years and just retired a year ago. And in terms of writing, I guess I would say I'm a career writer, although it's a funny word for poets because it's a career where you need a day job for an actual career. But I have been writing poetry. I think I probably started writing poems and stories when I was a kid, not too long after I actually learned how to write, and then got more serious about it in my 20s. And once I got serious about it, I never turned back and have spent the rest of my life writing and publishing poems and teaching poetry at the college level.
I'm still a Nebraska writer and will be until the day I die. I had grown up in upstate New York and gone to school in Boston and had my first child in Boston. And when we moved to Nebraska for the University of Nebraska, my mother was alarmed. She was not provincial. She had been born in England, but she thought Nebraska would not have canned goods. And she was alarmed. I could go on and on. But the minute we drove into town and I saw the horizon, I felt as if something inside of me clicked deeply. And in my years at the university, I was also working with the Nebraska Arts Council in the federal program Artists in the Schools. And so I traveled throughout Nebraska, staying in the homes of generous community members in small communities in Nebraska. And I would be there for 5 days teaching in the public schools and meeting members of the community. And I had an office in each school, so I would write there. I was committed to doing my work publicly by teaching, but also doing my work, which is usually private, in the view of the students so they can see a publishing writer at work. So my love for Nebraska deepened as I went on.
I think the biggest influence being in Nebraska has had on my writing is probably the students that I have worked with. As many people who might be watching this would know, the University of Nebraska has a quite well-known graduate program in creative writing, both an MA and a PhD. We usually make top 10 lists when people put such lists together. And then we also have a fairly lively undergraduate program in creative writing. So I've gotten to work with so many fantastic students from all over, and they constantly challenge you and surprise you. And, you know, I would find myself sometimes giving some advice to students in a class or answering a student question a certain kind of way. And then 2 days later, I'd be writing and realizing that maybe I wasn't taking my own advice. And so in that sense, I think the teaching opportunity that coming to Nebraska has offered me has probably been the biggest thing. And of course, the landscape and the flora and fauna and the people creep into your poems. I don't necessarily write about Nebraska. I do have poems that are specifically about Nebraska, about Lincoln, about a certain incident that happened here. But I don't feel like I'm as embedded in Nebraska as some Lincoln writers who many of you would know, somebody like Ted Kooser or Twyla Hansen or people like that, who are so steeped in both the geography and the culture. So for me, it's a more subtle thing, but the opportunities of the teaching here in Nebraska have been a huge influence.
When I put the reading together today, I did not choose the poems that I wrote in the small communities. And there are many and many and many of those poems. But of course, the people who enabled my writing are the people who most fiercely influenced my work. And the first one I have to say was Bernice Sloat, who became the editor of Prairie Schooner and chose to work with me and support me through my entire career, the beginning of my entire literary career. She gave me any title that I wanted. Periodically, she would say to me, well, you've been contributing editor and writing for the magazine for a few months now. Is there something else you want to do? And I would say, well, I'd really like to be poetry editor because I love poetry and I would like to read all the manuscripts that got fine, whatever you, and that was, she sent me to Breadloaf Writers Conference because Willa Cather had gone there. And she didn't feel she could go. She was too busy and she was traveling. Her first book on John Keats, a scholarly study, won the Christian Gauss Award. She was a very distinguished scholar, but she was also a fierce protector and provider of those people she felt might do well in life and might help her to further Prairie Schooner's agenda under her aegis. So Bernice Sloat, I would say, first of all. The second person I might remember was Hugh Luke, who died far too young. But Hugh Luke arrived from Texas in Nebraska the same year that I did. He was hired as a beginning assistant professor. And his first scholarly study was the lead article in PMLA, which was the premier journal. He was very brilliant, but he wrote poetry, I wrote poetry. We became very close friends, fast friends, family friends. And Hugh supported my work. And in fact, when he was acting editor of Prairie Schooner, when Bernice and Virginia had gone to England on a fellowship, Hugh took over Prairie Schooner and he brought me in. He asked me to write an essay about Robert Lowell, who had been my teacher in poetry at Boston University. And the book was called Near the Ocean. And so I did that, and he bribed me with a big carton of review books that were out of date that had come into Prairie Schooner. And thereafter, I began to write reviews for Prairie Skinner, and then I began to read poetry for Prairie Skinner. And when Bernice came back, she liked my work and kept me on.
There have been different friends along the way who have influenced me. There have been and supported me, sort of not economically, but sort of creatively. And then the many writers that I've read, who many of whom I never met personally, but whose work spoke to me in some way and made me want to try something that I perhaps had never tried before. So reading has always been a big influence, and it's one of the things that I would always preach to my students, that reading as widely as you possibly can is one of the most crucial things that you can do as a writer.
Well, I just wrote an essay for the University of Nebraska Press for their newsletter called Why I Write. It's a column and they asked me to write it. And so I remember that when I was a very small child, my mother pressed a pencil into my hand and said, "You can write with this." I wanted a pen, but I was too little for a pen. And I loved the feel of the pen in my left hand. And I began to write then. I was very young. And I've never stopped. I have a pencil in my hand right now. So I've always been a writer. I've written in many genres. I've never written fiction, but poetry, essays, reviews, critical articles.
I think it's something I always wanted, or I always did. I said that earlier. I think I started writing little poems and little stories probably by second or third grade, by the time I knew how to write sentences. But the idea of being a poet just seemed, as somebody who grew up in this very working class factory worker kind of environment, I think when I was a kid, if I would have told somebody that I wanted to be an astronaut, they would have said, "Oh, okay, just study really hard and whatever." But if I would have said, "Oh, I want to be a poet," they would have been like, "Okay, what do we say to that?" So it was always something that I did, but not necessarily something that I knew I could be, if that makes any sense. And so it was after I graduated from college and moved to New Orleans, which is where I met a lot of other people who were practicing poets, and would go to readings and would go to became part of this workshop group, and people just would start introducing you to other people, and "Oh, here's Grace, and she's a poet." And the first few times anyone ever said that, I was sort of, it took me a while to own that kind of thing.
So List and Story, its title came about as the title of a computer folder that held new poems. You know, you can call them George, or you can call them Samantha, or you can call them New, or but I have so many folders on my desktop. So this one I started calling List and Story, because my favorite forms are the catalog, the list, where you just, we all make lists constantly. And I love the regularity and the expansiveness of the list as a formal proposition for a poem. But I also love narrative. I love story poem. I mean, the poems always tell. There's always an implied or an explicit narrative in a poem. And that's it. If you look at my entire corpus, you would probably be able to sort list story. So that's how it came to be. And then when the book was accepted, I sent it out and to various presses to see what would happen. I couldn't give it another title. And then I realized that many years ago, Karen Kuhn, the brilliant printmaker, and I have been professional friends and colleagues for many years. And I did a piece of work for her. I don't know, I wrote the catalog copy for one of her brilliant shows. And she gave me in exchange some prints. And this one, Dale and I went out to Kenny and Karen's farm, and we went into Karen's studio and we chose. And this one has always been at the apex of the arch in our new house in Placitas. It speaks to me. It speaks to me of nature and culture. You know, another nice, comfortable pair that embraces everything, every endeavor, human intellectual endeavor, list and story, nature, culture, and it had to be the book cover. And I was lucky. I was working with the people so that became the book cover.
That's great.
So that's list and story.
As I said earlier, I did retire a year ago. And when I knew I was going to retire, I queried the University of Nebraska Press. I had published 5 books by that time, plus 4 chapbooks, and I've also edited 2 anthologies. And so I queried the University of Nebraska Press because I knew publishing Nebraska writers is one part of their mission. And I just thought, okay, after 25 years, I think I should qualify as a Nebraska writer at some point. So I queried them about if they might be interested in looking at selected poems. And my initial query was about just doing a selected poems, going through the 5 previous books and making those selections. And they came back and said, send a proposal and then send some sample poems. And they sent it to an outside reader and came back and said that, yes, they would be interested, but they wanted me to do a new and selected, which means that there are 5 sections where I've taken poems from the previously published books. And then there is also one section where it's the completely new poems. I'm sorry, I'm moving here because I need to plug my computer in because it's getting, okay. So that was quite a process. And I was very pleased and very happy that the University of Nebraska through Backwaters Press did agree to do the book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the practical stuff. People are always interested in that question, and it's something I'm adjusting to because while I was teaching, I prefer to write in the morning. I feel like when I'm fresh, I like to wake up, go for a walk, come home, make a cup of coffee, and then go to my writing room. And while I was teaching, of course, there were days when there was just no time to do that. And so you have to make time. If you want to be a writer, some people say you absolutely have to write every day. I don't necessarily think that's true, but you do have to find some sort of, you have to make room for it in your life. You just have to make the time. The time is there. You have to make the time. So now that I do have more of the time, I try to show up every morning, and just a lot of it is just scribbling that I don't know if it's ever going to amount to anything, but I never know that when I begin a poem. Will this actually turn into a real poem, or is this just going to be some scribbling in a notebook? And I've been trying also to, maybe go back at night and write a little bit. So I think the retirement during such a totally insane time with COVID and all this other stuff has made it harder for me to get into that new kind of rhythm, because I just feel so overwhelmed with some of the craziness sometimes. But I keep showing up. I keep showing up, and I figure something will happen eventually, even if it's in bits and pieces. And of course, I love it when, you know, something really takes off and you get into that zone, and I'm writing for an hour or two and look at my watch and the hour or two has passed and I didn't even realize that it was passing. But that doesn't always happen. And even if it doesn't happen, I do believe you need to keep showing up. And so that's one area where I try to follow my own advice.
Okay.
I don't think I ever stop working. I think when some people have very strong visual interface with the world.
Mm-hmm.
Mine is auditory. And whatever I am doing, I am listening for chips of sound or language that intersects with another language. Last night we looked at a French film, and I'm looking at the translation along the bottom of the screen, and I'm listening and I'm looking. So I am always a person engaged in translating the external world, or in translating the external world through the agency of my own internal functioning, trying to not understand it, but transmit it in some urgent way.
So the 5 previously published books, in my mind, are all very different. The first book that I published was called The Women at the Well, and that is a series of monologues written in the voices of biblical women. So the voice is not me speaking, it's Mary Magdalene speaking, or Eve speaking, or whoever. Then the next book I published was a series of fancy word ekphrastic poems, which are poems about visual art. And that's another mode that I have written in many times throughout my writing life. Nowhere All at Once and Retreats and Recognitions are 2 other books, and those books are the voice of the speaker in the poems is someone closer to a version of me. They're more autobiographically based, observationally based. Mm-hmm. And then the final individual book that's included is called Meantime. And that is also kind of in my own voice, although that whole book is written in the second person. I was trying to be a little more experimental in that book, and somehow consistently using the second person gave a kind of distance that I wanted to those poems. So I was looking back over, 20 some years of writing, really 30 some years of writing, I would say, and deciding, well, what do I want to keep in here as or put in this new book as representative of a lifetime of my writing. And sometimes it would be, I think this is one of the strongest poems. Even looking back after 25 years, I still think this is one of the strongest poems in that collection. Or I might look and say, well, maybe this isn't one of the strongest, but this really shows this idea or theme or trope that shows up again and again in my work. So I want to include it. So various factors figured into the selecting.
This book is certainly my book, but Kwame Dawes came to me and said, Hilda, I would like to do a book of your new and collected poems. what do you think of that? I said, oh, well, thank you. So then, of course, Kwame is fiercely brilliant and likes to be in control. And he wanted to call this book The Poetry of Hilda Raz. And I thought that sounded like a scholarly book. And he did ask me what I thought. And I said, I think that's a terrible idea. Nobody will understand. So he said, well, okay, you choose a title. And he gave me a list of possibilities. And I liked Letter from a Place I've Never Been, which is the name of a poem in the book.
Okay.
But I wrote Letter from a Place I've Never Been. I was teaching a night class, a graduate class at night. And I liked that. I was busy during the day and the students were too. So I would drive to Andrews Holland. So I gave them a prompt. It was almost Christmas. They were crazy to be gone. I was crazy to get out of there because I was going to Alaska for a teaching gig, teaching and reading and, artist in residence gig the next day. So I gave them this prompt: write a letter from a place I've never been. I thought it was okay. I thought it up in the car going to school. And I always wrote as well. And so that poem and that prompt became the tag for my new and collected poems edited by Kwame Dawes.
When I begin a poem, I'm not thinking about audience at all when I start a poem. It's me and a blank page and language. And I just start. Sometimes things will start with a cluster of words that just come to me out of nowhere. Sometimes it will be an image, and the image could be from a dream. The image could be something I saw walking down the street. And I just start writing, and the experiment every time when I start with that little cluster of words or that little image or that little voice, whatever it might be, is, will I actually be able to turn this into a poem? And a lot of the times the answer is, well, no, you won't. But you have to keep working at it. And so in the beginning, I'm not thinking of audience at all. I'm thinking of making a poem. It's not till, for me, much later in the process, when I think I'm pretty close to finished, then I'll try to sort of step back a little bit and read the poem and try to imagine, okay, if a person who's not me is reading this poem, will they necessarily understand what the heck I'm talking about? And, or do I have to tweak this in some way to make something clearer? And if I think something is maybe a little obscure or unclear, I often will try to change it, but sometimes the poem just seems to demand, no, it might not be clear to everybody, but it's got to stay this way. And so that it might mean a reader might have to work a little bit harder to enter this poem, but I go various ways with that. But in the beginning, it's just me and the language and the page, and can I make this poem?
Well, Hugh Luke used to say that he thought of one particular person, and that person might represent the muse in her various guises. I like that idea, but it isn't exactly my practice. I think I am speaking back to the universe, and I'm going to read one poem this afternoon. When you hear what you hear, how do you speak back to it? That's what I'm always thinking. This is coming in, and I have a wonderful office that has a big glass sliding door, and it looks out into this incredible desert high desert we live in. And what do I say back? like that.
Well, I think I touched on this a little bit with the previous question, in that I was looking back, and even though I see the books as very different, I would notice that I noticed more than I was conscious of things that were reappearing. So there was. When I'm writing the biblical poems, obviously there's a religious sort of aspect to that, even though I'm not particularly religious in a Judeo-Christian sort of traditional kind of way. But I grew up, went to Catholic school and grew up in that kind of tradition. But then even when I'm writing other poems, sort of religious questions come up, or questions, or I'm often writing about visual art, but sometimes even when I'm writing about something else, I start to think of it almost in somewhat visual terms.
Okay.
So, and I think I always had a little bit of a sense that I was doing that, but going through all that work and reading it, because I read a lot, but I don't necessarily sit around reading my own books all the time. But here I was forced to reread my books several times in order to really make my selections. So it just made me a little more conscious of some of the things that I had been doing over the course of my writing life.
That's such a great question. And I remember we did have this conversation on the computer. Grace's book is selected in new poems. Mine is collected in new poems. And Grace had complete control over her book. I had no control over my book because Kwame Dawes edited this book.
Mm-hmm.
And he and I talked a lot, but what he did was to take he wrote a scholarly essay to introduce the book that discusses the publication of each one of my several books that are collected in this book. And he took the books. And then the hard part was he wanted 2 additional sections, one section that contained poems that had been published in journals or anthologies before, but I'd chosen not to include in my several books, published books. He didn't want those poems to disappear. So I hired my son, Aaron Raz to one summer go through all this material. I mean, I was not going to do this. He did this. And then he sent the whole batch to Kwame. And Kwame chose what he wanted of those poems in the second last section of the book. Then he said to me, you must have poems you chose not to publish over these many years, 86 to 2020. I want to see those poems. So Aaron got to work again, and he went on my computer and he sieved out all these poems that for one reason or another I had chosen not to send out to be published, and sent all those to Kwame, and Kwame chose a whole bunch of them that are the last section of the book.
Okay.
And actually there was another process. He wanted to see all the poems that I had been writing after I left Nebraska. And if Nebraska totally infuses all of my books, New Mexico now is beginning to sift in slowly into my new work. So he chose all that stuff. And then John Kinsella, who is a dazzling writer, critic, poet, novelist. There isn't any genre he doesn't. He lives in Australia now. But I've never met John Kinsella, but he began to follow my work when he was at Cambridge in England. And he started a publishing house called Salt, and a magazine and he had been publishing my poems for years and years and years. So John wrote the essay that starts the book.
And welcome everybody to the John H. Ames reading series, and to say hello from the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors, which is in the background of my screen. We're located in Bennett Martin Public Library in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm Diane Wilson, and I'm the curator of our collection here. And I'm also very happy to welcome people to our first virtual program being held on Zoom. Today's event is being recorded, and it'll be made available on the library's YouTube channel at a later date. For those of you that aren't familiar with our service, the Heritage Room's mission is to preserve and promote works by and about Nebraska authors. It's funded by an endowment supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, and that was established through the Foundation for Lincoln City Libraries. We're grateful for their help, which makes events like this possible. The Ames Reading Series serves as a venue for authors to share their works with our community, and this is the 225th program since it began in 1985. Today, we're honored to host authors Hilda Raz and Grace Bauer. Hilda is the editor of the endowed Mary Burritt Christensen Poetry Series at the University of New Mexico Press and poetry editor of Bosque Press. She lives in Placitas, New Mexico. She was the first Lushai professor and editor in the Department of English at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And Hilda continues her connection here with the book prizes of Prairie Schooner. As an editor and writer, she's published 14 books, including her two most recent works. One is titled List and Story, and the second one is titled Letter from a Place I've Never Been, New and Collected Poems, 1986 to 2020. Grace Bauer is the author of 6 books of poems, most recently one titled Unholy Heart, New and Selected Poems, that was published in 2021. In addition, she's co-edited these two anthologies that I'll mention. The first is titled Nasty Women Poets, an unapologetic anthology of subversive verse. And the other is titled Umpteen Ways of Looking at a Possum, Critical and Creative Responses to Everett Maddox. An Aaron Douglas Professor Emerita, Grace taught for 25 years in the creative writing program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So in today's program, Hilda will be reading, followed by Grace. And we're just asking people to hold their questions until the end of both readings, and then you can always submit questions through the chat function. That's how we'll do the questions, and I will then pass those on to the authors at the end. So welcome, Hilda and Grace.
Thanks so much to the Ames Reading Series and Diane Wilson, who's curator of the Jane Pope Geske Room at the Bennett Martin Public Library in Lincoln, Nebraska, where we lived for many, many decades. And thanks to my colleague and friend, Grace Bauer, for reading here with me today. Now I have completely gone offline. So here we go. Am I there? Can you see me, Diane?
Yes,
Yes, we can see you and hear you.
Okay, all right. I thought I'd start with the first poem in last year's book called List and Story, which I have here someplace. And one more from that book, then read some poems previously unpublished in book form from Letter from a Place I've Never Been, the collected, and new poems that Kwame Dawes edited and chose, and it was published in April by the University of Nebraska Press. Here's Autobiography, the first poem in List and Story. I've stolen a chair for you, sawed off the arms. For breakfast, stirred up plover's eggs. Once I flew to the moon in order to press your hands to her face. I strung a magic key around my neck for my roller skates. On my feet, they clanked and threw sparks on the sidewalk. My mom wore an apron when she wasn't wearing gloves. I wore silk to the dance, midnight blue with a keyhole neckline, a soft bow. I married for the childbed and didn't die. I walked out the door on my own 2 feet. Alaska wove color through the sky. The dog sled team at full run shat frozen turds that missed me. Up again at night, I learned hot milk beats tea every time. The walls all color war well and framed up paintings I accumulate. My house has a bedroom. Much of my life is over. Pleasing others is my greatest sin. When my ribs knit, I swore never again to surrender. I lied. My knee healed with a scar. 4 husbands vanished on horseback, but the crops didn't fail. Winter is a season like any other. Now spring is all, spring moving into summer. Sleep in wind, in voices. What's under pressure breaks out in cactus flowers. Ants abound in the arroyos and coyotes. Some of what I couldn't stand to lose, I lost. In every room, a pencil. I like to collaborate in everything in life, and especially on projects. And since I'm a writer, most of my projects are writing projects. Here's Collaboration, which is page 346 in this new book. Collaboration. This one writes, steps up, steps back. The other holds the pad still, a blank. The fear of pencils is one's contribution. I can't. Shut up, says the other, curtsying. I can. These two, they do. Look, here's their book. I can read, says one. I can talk, says the other. To celebrate, one wraps fingers around a glass. The other waits for steak. One pushes the other, picks up a knife, hungry. The other plays with salad. One holds an apple, very still. Good job, says the other, fingers the handle. The apple peel falls into a lovely spiral. Already the other is pushing it towards disposal. You don't have to get along to collaborate. Here's Long Night, page 393. It's a little short poem. It's autumn in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1981 when I wrote this poem. Long night. Somehow across the street in the yard of the cloistered nuns, the sun has made radiant again leaves of the tree in the yard. They flame in this early morning before winter. Just this time of year. Here's Anna Bites Her Friend Emma at Preschool on page 4000. I've never read this poem before in a reading. Anna is my older granddaughter, and Ava is her little sister. In this poem, I imagine Anna's voice. Anna is speaking, and this is why Anna bites her friend Emma at preschool. Baby Ava barks in the night. We get up in our pajamas, go to the hospital on the train. A hot room bigger than our kitchen. Wet light, more kids than the park. Look, are there faucets in the walls? Drips? And where's peppermint? Someone screams, someone littler than I am, and also someone bigger. Everyone not crying has a mask tied with elastic over their face. I can see in. They shiver, and one kid breathes hard like that dog. Ava barks, then someone takes her away with Mama, maybe to a faucet and a mask. I sit very still. Papa holds my hand. Light hurts and wears the air for Ava, who cries and makes noise in the corner where I can't see. Papa reads me a book, then says, we have to go home on the train. I've been very good, but Mama and Ava will stay. Papa carries me. He is warm and tall, then nothing. Now it's birthday, red-tailed hawk, page 405. Birthday, red-tailed hawk. When I came toward the house and looked up to watch a bronze wing become the whole bird, flash a red tail, the raptor's beak gold, and circling the requisite small bird making a fuss, surely the universe was saying, happy birthday. Not so the silence that followed, nor my heart folded shut against this spring day. A few more years maybe, and then the grave quiet. I wrote that in 2010 on my birthday. Here's a poem in the same diction, little different setting. This is set in New Mexico at a writers' conference where I was teaching, up all night. On the balcony, early sun, water hurrying below in the ditch, water rush, grass meadow, hedgerow, bird song. What else can you call to call back? In June snow on the low mountain, green, what's its name? Truchas Peak. Below, little fists of daisies, a few open-handed, rock of granite gray and cream. Suspended, a branch grows slowly through the hole it made in a rusty can. Logs propped over the ditch. In the far field, a horse is blurred by the wings of the mountain jay so close, I can see only bright flicker and swoosh. Don't stop, beetle on the porch floor. Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop. And here's Close on page 416. Close. This poem braids together interwoven obsessions with two things. One is clothes, clothing, and the other is, surprise, death. Clothes. The wedding dress, white lawn, starched firm, the bodice, 2 points like tulips, organdy overskirt, and linen embroidery over a bell-shaped skirt, also in points, white linen shoes with heels so high they sank into the grass of the backyard where the usual vows were said. 2 straps of silk over skinny shoulders. The veil. The sight of Lisa, a skull balanced easily on bones, dying and still upright, chatting, joking, her full head of hair not yet gray. How can she die? But she did. And the navy silk with the pure white collar, 6 inches wide and bias cut to surround shoulders, yet low for show as needed. Buttons of glittery up the front, worn with black velvet kitten heels with small glitter at the instep. When she died, what then? The crowds of her friends, the well-wishers, the flowers. You put on death as you put on clothes. That's my fantasy. The next one is called Formal. This is a form I sort of put together, but each stanza tells a kind of a story. And some of these stories link together, or do they? Formal. I was made to be someone's mother. She says so and believes what she says. What she says is impossible. 4 misses. In this desert new to me, we are happy. I say so and believe what I say. Everything old is left behind in graves. Moved to a better state, she finds a job. They say so and believe what they say. White walls in their house, at last a view. They fight like crazy over nothing but the heat. They say so, but neither is listening. Too late the season turns, they filed. Each one waits in line for authorization. They say yes and believe what they say. The clerks call the manager, but no proof, no receipts. You've been dead for several months, gone for years. I say so and believe what I say. You weren't missed for a minute, not until now. The smell at his shoulder while dancing wasn't pleasant. Believe me, I've never said so until now. Yet we married. Our bed was delicious, but I left him. In the middle of the night, a breeze, then a wind, the coyotes yip, then howl, believe what they say. At noon, the sun scalds even the cottontail under a juniper. You are hiding. I say so and believe what I say. Your sons carry on without you, racing cars, buying houses. What is pain? He asked me over lunch, his eyes filling. He asked me and believed what I said. I answered his question. Absence. And here's granddaughter Ava from the earlier poem where she was just an infant. Anna bites her friend Emma at preschool. Now Ava is 3. I'm telling this story here, but it's Ava who is singing. It's called Ava Sings on page 422. Another one I've never read before out loud. Ava sings. She takes my hand, pulls me into the kitchen. She's a tiny child. We sit at her table. I overlap the chair. She fills hers up. She's eating the last piece of cake surrounded by cookie cutters, alphabet letters, shapes. Christmas is soon. Now it's time to make cookies, she says, out of the cake. Stars and cookies that connect like this. She shows me on the tabletop. No, it's time for the cookies to bake. I'm hungry, nibbling crumbs, trying to see the cold kettle on the stove. Now it's time to make more things. I get some Play-Doh, roll it out, not very much. She rolls a snake, coils it up. A bowl for the salad, not very big. Now we soften the bowl. She shows me how. Just as good as new, but we still can eat it. As her tiny fingers move, she sings. Did you hear that song on the radio? It's just a song I made up. Not today, but tomorrow. We will get by. You never know. That's literally true, every word. And the last poem in the collected is called Victory Garden Grass Skirt. Here at the start of the poem, I'm probably 4 or 5. I was a child of the Second World War, born in 1938. Hitler came to power in 1933. Pearl Harbor, as we know, was 1941 when America entered the war. We had victory gardens, and I had a grass skirt. We had one, but not the other when I was very little. Mornings before the heat set in, I picked up my yellow trowel, exited through the back door, evading, as usual, my mother. The tomatoes were usually red by the time of the highest heat at noon. I had no intention of picking one and eating it, hot juice running down my chin, the smell, the crisp taste of first bites prickling. But you know that I always did. First one, then another, and no one seemed to notice. I grazed vegetable gardens all up and down the neighbors' hills. In junior high, Sue Ellen Smith brought from Hawaii the skirt, a sample of vacation ecstasy. She modeled it, we all did, one after another, and wiggled. The skirt wiggled too, hips. Who knew? I wanted jiggly breasts, but no, it never happened. My mother's favorite flower was gladiolus in a tall vase. Home from the grocery with a bunch, Niveas and gold ones in my arms, I take down her heavy vase from the closet. After my cutting and trimming propped in a circle, here they are, the only sign of reconciliation in the room. 12 ripe tomatoes in a bowl, about to reach perfection in the kitchen. What happened? I don't know. I didn't like that woman, and she didn't like me. I was a cruel child. Verbs escape my memory, but our victory garden and Sue Ellen's skirt retain their fragrance. And I too love gladiolus spears, 14 buds on most stalks, and the sight of my mother's hands arranging and changing them in the window of my childhood as war raged in Europe and on all fronts. There's a nod to E. Cummings, poet I loved when I was young, in that poem. And I'll just close by reading a poem again that's so completely set in Nebraska that I didn't want to leave it out. It's called What Happens, page 97, early. When I was teaching at the University of Nebraska and writing, I was part of a federal program administered by the Nebraska Arts Council called Poets or Artists in the Schools. And I was often sent outstate Nebraska to small communities. This poem called What Happens was the title of one of my books, but it happened in Alma, Nebraska. What happens? In Alma, Nebraska at midnight, into a spring storm, the young doctor goes out. He says he is going to deliver the widow's baby. I am sitting in the parlor with my new friend, our landlady, who is painting my nails what she calls a good color. She paints her own and tells the story of the widow. Outside the window, the rosy snow comes down on the crocus. Thank you, Diane, and thank you all for being here. I'm glad that Grace Bauer, who was a longtime colleague and friend, will read next.
I inadvertently raised my hand while Hilda was reading. I was trying to clap, but so it's not clear to me. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you.
Okay.
I'm not sure how to put your hand down. So
okay, that's fine. I was trying to hit the clapping icon there under but somehow I raised my hand instead.
Okay.
So I'll raise my hand and read poems. So thank you to Diane for inviting me to read as part of this series. And thank you to Bo for the technical assistance. And it's always a pleasure to read with Hilda, who's been a friend and colleague since I came to Nebraska. And I will be reading from, okay, let's see. Even though I have it on speaker view, I'm not really seeing myself. I'm seeing Diane, but that's okay. So I'm reading from Unholy Heart, New and Selected Poems, which just came out last March from Backwaters Press, which is an imprint of the University of Nebraska Press. The first poem I'm going to read, I thought I would read some poems that were somewhat Nebraska and or Midwest connected on some level. And this poem is called Nowhere All at Once. It's pretty much a poem about the experience of being in a plane and looking down over the landscape and feeling like, well, where are you when you're in a plane? You know, so are you nowhere? If you're flying over Iowa, are you in Iowa? It's a chicken and egg kind of question, I suppose. So nowhere all at once. Nowhere all at once, and content for the moment to be so far above it all, the Rorschach of Midwestern landscape below you repeating square, square, square. The world looks different when you are forced to face it from such heights and before dawn, in hours when you're accustomed to being lost in dreams, that other world you create to help you make sense of, to recover from this world you now look down on, moving between destinations, each a place you have called home, meaning you realize something different each time, just as this no and every place you are now, this up in the air, is where you always are. And this is another poem about travel, but a different kind of travel. It's called Off the Map. And as you're listening, you may hear the repetition of certain words at the end of the line. And that's part of the form of the poem, which is a tritina, which means there's 3 line stanzas and each line ends with a repeated word or phrase. So, off the map. Wherever you go, there you are, the bumper sticker read. A woman driving the red Explorer that cut right in front of me on the freeway. As I hit the brakes, I had a vision of where I was going. I wasn't really looking forward to the destination, just going on autopilot, convinced mere motion was progress of sorts. Though I had read that being fully present where you are was key, that had never worked for me. I felt restless, vaguely insufficient. Wherever I was, a part of me always longing for something that wasn't there, eager to get going while the going was good. Still felt good to zoom past the mythical crossroads before the light turned red. But now this passing stranger startled me into attention, like a siren or a red light flashing in my rearview mirror. I realized the road ahead of me was nothing but more road, that I had no idea where I was going or what I'd do when I got to wherever it was, that I was only going because I didn't know how to stop, spinning my wheels so fast I failed to read all the signs saying slow down or detour or exit here, beckoning me to pull over, get out, stretch my legs for a while, figure out what was driving me. The woman in red was long gone. Perhaps she'd already arrived where she was going, and I'm still going strong, here and there, another woman, another story you have read. One thing that I have done throughout my writing life. And this book, being a selected poems, does select poems from 5 previously published books, and then there's also a section of new poems. So one of the things I've always done is written poems about visual art, so-called ekphrastic poems. This particular poem is about a painting that people in Lincoln, Nebraska will be familiar with because it is housed in the Sheldon Art Museum, and I love to go visit it. And it is, the title of the poem is the title of the painting, which is Room in New York, after Edward Hopper. It's a just marvelous, marvelous painting. Room in New York. Note how many rectangles and squares, the window we view the couple through, the 3 black lines we read as shutters, 3 indistinct pictures that hang on the flamboyant green walls, the old black upright she pings upon with a single index finger. Note how the red of her dress repeats the lamp and chair, how the stark white of his shirt echoes the sheet of what is meant to represent music, although it is most curiously blank. It is only the figures themselves who appear to have nothing in common. Not just that he is absorbed in his paper, because who among us has not been so eager to learn the news of the world that we've allowed ourselves to get lost in print? But look how she sits at that piano, not facing it as someone intent on playing would. No, she sits as if she meant to face him, but has turned to the keys as an afterthought, a way to entertain herself while she waits to catch his eye as she has ours. Her pale skin is almost ghostly, the bow on her shoulder an odd attempt at adornment, like the dead-centered doily that protects the small brown table he is leaning toward from nothing. I imagine her sounding out middle C, perhaps hitting a sharp for emphasis. I imagine the piano itself is hopelessly out of tune, and that both of them have been waiting their whole lives for attention, each other's or anyone's, for a song to take them somewhere beyond the confines of the space they are in. But his stocks have gone down, or his team may be up for the pennant, and she has her club or some project to type for the boss. The city outside is all menace and promise, all streetlight and exhaust. We ourselves could at any moment climb a fire escape, pick a lock, tear down the brown of that door, and be inside there with them, like them, beside ourselves, bored to distraction, without a word to say. The next poem is a persona poem, which means, as Hilda had done in several of the poems that she read, I'm the speaker of the poem is not me, but someone else. This poem is called Note from the Imaginary Daughter, and it is a response to a poem by Weldon Keys, who is a Nebraska poet, and painter and many other things. There is a painting of his in the Heritage Room that one can see. Keys has a poem called For My Daughter, and it is just a fantastic poem, but also one of the most depressing poems you're ever going to read. It begins with Keys sort of presumably looking down at the sleeping daughter, and it starts very tenderly, but then it just turns in the middle of the poem, and it's very bleak by the end. The last line of the poem is, "I have no daughter, I desire none," and it's just devastatingly bleak. What some people may know about Keys is that he eventually disappeared and presumably committed suicide because his car was found at the entrance to the Golden Gate Bridge, but his body was never found. And there is a certain mystique about Keys and a legend about Keys that he didn't really commit suicide, but just sort of chose to disappear from his life. And a lot of people said they thought he went to Mexico, and some people who knew him said he would talk about disappearing. So I don't know what is true, but that all figures into this poem, where the daughter, who he says, I have no daughter, I desire none, I imagine that she exists and is speaking to her imaginary father. Note from the imaginary daughter. Mother always swore your plunge was faked, so you could vanish unknown into travel. I waited for a postcard, some sign I could take as proof she was right, some thread I'd unravel back to you, wherever you were. Mexico, she guessed. In pictures, you look sad but kind. Mother said you were brilliant but confused. She said I might not like the man I'd find if I ever did. She said you'd only used her love for art. Still, she wished you'd let her go along. She kept the poems, the paintings too. And I composed myself a father who filled my desire, a man too real to mourn. Some nights I dream you dead, some days unborn. And that poem is a sonnet, and it follows, as is Keyes's poem, the source poem, and I follow his sort of unusual rhyme scheme in mine, or try to. I guess I'm reading another kind of a travel poem. It's called Means of Transport, and it's a poem that began just me walking around my neighborhood, where I live in the near South. It always amuses me to say that, because I lived for a good part of my life in the actual South, in Louisiana and Virginia. So it amuses me to live in a neighborhood called the Near South, which it is not near to the South. But I was walking around and just saw a truck that had a sign that said, had the word Utah on it. And so that just got me going. Utah being one of the few states in the country that I've never actually stepped foot in. So Lincoln people and Nebraska people might recognize some landmarks in this poem. Means of transport. At 9th and South, you see a sign that makes you ponder Utah, the word more than the state, and what it means. You like the way it occupies your mouth, contains a little ah, as the place may too, though you once read a poet who thought Omaha must be magical. Om, aha, and you know that's not quite right. There's no accounting for sound and sense. Words signify, but sing as well. They may be maps, but the roads they chart keep changing direction, even as we drive or walk, which is what you were doing at 9th and South on Saturday, when suddenly Utah became a possible place to be, though you have never been, except for in what may pass for a poem, i.e. this, a meandering at best through a state of mind. You are stringing words like rosary beads as you pass St. Francis Church. Poem like a prayer, a place you walk your mind around in, winding your way home. This is another kind of travel poem, and I moved to Nebraska. Before I lived in Nebraska, I lived in Southwest Virginia and in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And the Blue Ridge, of course, are an old mountain range. They're not as high as the Rockies, but they are indeed blue and gray, and they can be very misty. And when I moved to Lincoln, it happened frequently when I first moved here that I would be looking out at a vista, whether I was driving outside of town or whatever. And here, of course, we have our spectacular skies. And especially if there would be cloud banks low toward the horizon, I would look, and for a few seconds I would think, wow, the mountains are really hazy today. And then I would click, and no, you're not in the mountains, you're in Nebraska, and those are clouds. and it happened for about the first year or two I was here, and then it stopped happening. And then maybe about 2 years ago, every once in a while it started happening again. It was really, this is really kind of hallucinatory mirage kind of experience. So this is called Highway to Mirage. This is not the first time you have mistaken clouds for hills here on the plains, where the horizon stitches a hazy seam between sky and land, and the eye does its best to contain what appears too vast to fathom, scouting the distance for a silo or a fence line that tells you someone claims they own this space, though wind and weather will often insist otherwise. There is something to be said for persistence, the human attempt to root as deeply as the native grass, which in certain light ripples like the flat water they named this state after, a grand illusion like those clouds that for a moment convinced you they were solid enough to climb. I'm jumping back now in time and to the very first book I ever published, which is called The Women at the Well. And The Women at the Well is a book of persona poems again, all spoken in the voices of women from the Bible. And it includes both Old and New Testament. And this is the final poem in that book, and it's the title poem of the book. And instead of just one woman speaking, it is a chorus of voices, because that trope of women at the well appears in both the Old and the New Testament. And so the women are speaking in a chorus. The women at the well. We enter on cue, bearing prophecy, earthen vessels waiting to be filled, directions to the homes of fathers, brothers, husbands, who always take you in and treat you well. And we are taken in by your telling, tales of how one learns to walk in a foreign land, moments past recalled by one who never watched them happen, plots still being written in which we wait for our names to appear. We hear most when we are least observed, so we are often silent, serving the choicest meats from our larders, the saltiest olives, sweetest breads, red wines from deep in our cellars where we carefully rinse the bottles clear of dust. We always fill your cup before it is quite empty. We have learned how to keep strangers talking, our own thirsts quenched. This is what keeps us returning each day to the circle of women, drawing buckets from the circle of stone at the center of town. We soak clothing, refresh weary livestock, wet our lips, composing our own stories as we wait for our reflections in the mirror of water to speak what we have always known. So I'm traveling now to my backyard, I guess, and this poem is called Not Quite Nirvana. I have duct taped the Buddha's head to his rusting body and draped him with a string of plastic pearls pitched years ago from a Mardi Gras float into my clinging hands. The repairs do not appear to have marred the serenity of his repose. He continues to sit, full lotus, between the Solomon seal and sage. In the neighboring bed, a plastic flamingo has weathered another winter. Its pink less gauche than when I first planted it there, but still perched in kitschy splendor amidst a riot of daylilies and weeds. Both the Buddha and I choose to accept with equanimity, or perhaps in my case, sloth. Content as I feel in this moment to do nothing but stand, statue still, observing the tiny agitation of a hummingbird who flits, fleeting as a thought, into a pot of impatience, while on the rickety fence that contains all of us and nothing, a jay, blue as sky, squawks his raucous, unlikely ohm. So I'll read just 2 more poems. This poem is from the final section of new poems, and many of the poems in that section are elegiac, about the death of my father, about the death of a friend. And I'll often have dreams where people I've known from various points in my life, from various places I've lived, show up together, even though they would never have known each other in real life. And this is definitely one of those dreams. All my dead say grace. They are milling about a spacious lawn, waiting for the food I'm cooking over an open fire. The pot is huge and black and bubbling wildly. If I could breathe in this dream, I'm sure whatever I'm stirring would stink. But my dead look like they're having the time of their lives. Some who died as strangers are laughing together, like the friends they might have become. Couples are dancing to music only they can hear, while a few wallflowers who have planted themselves on the periphery scan the sky for a distraction of birds. The least I can do is make this meal a good one, bring my bounty to the long table, which appears now against a wall of arborvitae, already laid out with bone china, fine silver, crystal glasses ready to be raised. My dead take their seats, join hands, bow their heads, and whisper a word that happens to be my name, which, if said before eating, means thanks, which is what I am trying to say to all my dead. And I will end with the final poem in Unholy Heart, new and selected poems. This poem is called Update on Emily. The Emily in the poem is Emily Dickinson. And what you might want to know, if you don't already, is that the final 2 words of this poem are what is written on Dickinson's tombstone. Because death stops for everyone and is rarely ever kind, she writes her letters to the world just a piece for the peace of her mind. The world, of course, rarely replies, not even an email or text. When you're a fly on the wall, a nobody, it's a silence you learn to expect. Yet the letters have become a way of life, or rather living, as natural to her as air and breath, her religion, a kind of believing. Will her words ever dazzle, shine faint light through the cracks? Either way, in the end, she knows we're all called back. Thank you.
Well, Grace and Hilda, thank you both for such beautiful readings today and for being willing to try out this new paradigm of doing a virtual author reading with the Ames reading.